One of the big open questions is what Donald Trump might do to the January 6th convicts, whether he might pardon them. He's flirted with that on the campaign trail. Does he go through with it? Joining us now, January 6th Select Committee former lead investigator Timothy Hafey, Lisa Rubin, Tom Nichols, and David French are still with us. All right, so Timothy, I'm going to begin with you. What do you expect Donald Trump might do with all of those who stormed the Capitol, have been arrested and convicted for their crimes?
Katie, all I can say is he'll do what he said he's going to do, which is wholesale pardons. I don't know if there will be a principled line drawn between some of these defendants. There are varying shades of gray here in terms of culpability. Seditious conspiracy is very different from trespassing. I am hopeful that there will be some principled distinctions between them, as opposed to a blanket pardon of every Jan 6 defendant being pardoned, right? These were serious, horrific crimes against the very seat of government and the lawful process of the certification of the election. So my hope is that as many of those convictions, pleas, and findings by juries stand. But again, the president-elect has said repeatedly that these are patriots, or that these are political prisoners, that they deserve our thanks, not our critical conviction and condemnation. So I don't know what exactly he will do.
Tim, you're so intimate with the evidence that the January 6th committee compiled for its hearings, including all of those videos, so much video of what happened on the Capitol on that day, what the rioters were doing, what they were saying, who they were attributing their movements to. Just when you're thinking about what Donald Trump might do come January with these folks right here, what stands out to you in terms of who these people are and what their intention was?
Well, first of all, there was a false narrative that I think the committee completely rebutted, that this was some kind of either government operation or Antifa or sort of far left operation. There's just no evidence of any of that. This was a group of people who falsely believed, incited by the former president, that the election was stolen without evidence, that decided to take matters into their own hands and prevent the certification of the election. That is a crime against democracy, and that's consistent across. Now, there are degrees within the crowd of the steps that people took. Seditious conspiracy is the most serious. That is the intentional use of force to overthrow a lawful function of government. That's a very, very serious charge in our history. And there are a lot of people, members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, that were convicted by jurors of seditious conspiracy. And it would be a huge threat to the rule of law to pardon that kind of serious criminal activity. That goes all the way down to some people that trespassed. And again, that's a very different level of culpability, still criminal, but very different. So some of them, I wouldn't be surprised if they get pardoned.
Lisa, I know you've been talking to sources surrounding what might happen. What have they told you?
I think, Katie, I want to be careful because a number of those sources spoke to MSNBC off the record about what might happen. But I think we should take the former president and the future president at his word with respect to the January 6th defendants and convicts. And, to Tim's point about seditious conspiracy being a line, I'm not sure that, in fact, is the line. When I think about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who were convicted of those crimes, there was planning for violence, but there wasn't an actual engagement in violence by most of those folks. The line that might be drawn here is one about what did you do on the Capitol grounds that day. And if you were a person who, for example, was a mere trespasser, or even if you dressed up in costume, for example, like Jacob Chansley, and sort of terrorized people just by your presence, but, went on the Senate days, or you rappelled down the Senate gallery, that might not be enough to constitute a violent act in the minds of some folks affiliated with the future Department of Justice.
Tom, I want to get you in on this because at least some of the January 6 rioters were ex-military. The Oath Keepers had a few of them as well. What message does it send to those folks out there who might be thinking that their oath is more to a person and not the Constitution?
That is the message. The message is be loyal to me rather than to the Constitution. And if you get into trouble, I'll cover you. I'll have your back. And, this whole conversation, I mean, it's almost otherworldly that we're having this conversation about pardoning people who have done these dreadful things against our democracy, against the seat of government. You know, I used to work in that building. I stood where a lot of those people were. And, you know, I think for a lot of Americans who've just put it out of their mind that this was just, you know, a bad day that got out of hand. I mean, it really is shocking that we've memory hold it. And I think in particular, for Trump to talk about pardoning people, he's talking about saying, you are, you know, you're my folks, you're my loyal, you know, troops out there. And I think that's especially dangerous to tell people who were in law enforcement and the military and some in federal service as well who violated their oath that you know, that those oaths don't matter, that the only thing that matters is whether or not you showed loyalty to the boss. And I hope, as Lisa just said, I mean, you know, you have to take him at his word that he's going to do this, but I hope that somewhere in that White House more sane and cooler heads prevailed, but I don't have much hope for that.
Well, Tom, couple that with a potential Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. How do you expect this to influence military rank and file?
I think the appointment of Hegseth actually, you know, is not going to be as welcome in the military as people think it might be, because they're, first of all, our enlisted and officer corps, you know, these are people who understand their duty. They understand their constitutional oath. They care about the people standing next to them and, you know, in line or sitting next to them in an office. So, you know, this kind of trollery of taking somebody, and I think a lot of this is what Trump's doing. It's just kind of trolling the public, of taking someone who has no qualifications, can't really look after the 3 million people in the DOD. Leave aside all the other problems of, could you possibly imagine Pete Hegseth talking to his opposite number in Beijing or Moscow? You know, one of the things that folks in the military care about is that their people are looked after by the chain of command going all the way to the top. Pete Hegseth, whatever his intentions, even if they're good intentions, and not all of them I think are, but even if he wanted to, he doesn't have the experience or the ability to do that kind of a job. And I think there'd be some concern about that. But, you know, again, the message would be that what matters most in every government department, including justice and defense and the intelligence community, the three I worry about the most, is that loyalty matters more than competence. Loyalty to Donald Trump matters more than competence, and it matters more than loyalty to the Constitution. And that's the message Trump's been trying to send.